The studio lights of Good Morning America burned a little hotter that morning as Karoline Leavitt took her seat across from George Stephanopoulos. The familiar hum of cameras, the quiet murmur of producers behind glass, and the practiced smiles of the crew all suggested business as usual. Yet there was a subtle stiffness in the air, the kind that seasoned television veterans recognize long before viewers ever sense it. Karoline adjusted her microphone, her expression composed, eyes steady, aware that this was not going to be a friendly exchange. George offered a polite greeting, but it was clipped, efficient, stripped of warmth. From the very first question, the rhythm felt off. George opened with a measured summary of the controversy that had brought Karoline onto the show, his words carefully chosen, his tone outwardly calm. Karoline listened without interrupting, hands folded loosely in her lap, nodding once as if to acknowledge she understood the framing, even if she didn't agree with it. When she responded, her voice was clear and confident, delivering a concise rebuttal that challenged the premise of the question itself. The answer was calm, but it landed with force. A few heads in the control room lifted. George leaned back slightly, lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before he moved on. The second question came faster, sharper, layered with implications rather than direct accusations. Karoline met it head-on, refusing to soften her language or dodge the underlying issue. She spoke about media narratives, about selective outrage, about how certain voices were amplified while others were dismissed. Her words were deliberate, each sentence carefully paced, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the polish. George interjected midway through her response, steering the conversation back toward his original framing. Karoline paused, waited, then calmly finished her thought anyway. The interruption didn't rattle her, but it shifted something fundamental in the exchange. The smiles faded. George's posture stiffened as he leaned forward, elbows closer to the desk, his tone now unmistakably adversarial. He challenged her statistics, questioned her sources, and suggested her perspective ignored broader realities. Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. She corrected him on a point of fact, citing details with precision. When he tried to cut in again, she raised her hand just enough to signal she wasn't finished. It was a small gesture, but on live television, it felt seismic. Around them, the studio seemed to contract. The easy banter typical of morning television evaporated, replaced by something heavier, more charged. Karoline spoke about accountability, about who gets questioned aggressively and who is allowed to glide through interviews unchallenged. She made it clear she believed this conversation was a perfect example of that imbalance. George responded by emphasizing the show's commitment to fairness, his voice cool but tight, the words sounding rehearsed rather than reassuring. As the exchange escalated, the producer's voice crackled faintly in George's earpiece. He nodded almost imperceptibly, then pivoted to a question that felt less like an inquiry and more like a verdict. Karoline inhaled slowly before answering, choosing not to match his sharpness with her own. Instead, she spoke with controlled intensity, accusing the media of mistaking persistence for hostility when it came from certain guests. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw. George attempted to regain control, reminding her of time constraints and the need to move on. Karoline countered that difficult conversations deserved more than sound bites. Her tone remained respectful, but it was unyielding. Each time George tried to redirect, she brought the focus back to what she saw as the core issue: who gets to speak freely, and who is expected to stay within invisible lines. The control room monitors flickered with internal messages. A planned graphic never appeared. The show was drifting off course. The tension reached a breaking point when George interrupted her mid-sentence for the third time in under a minute. Karoline stopped speaking altogether and looked at him directly. The pause stretched, just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then she said, evenly, that she was happy to answer tough questions, but not willing to be talked over. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. For a brief moment, the entire studio fell silent. George straightened, clearly taken aback, and responded defensively, insisting he was simply doing his job. Karoline replied that she was doing hers too. The exchange no longer felt like an interview, it felt like a standoff. Producers exchanged glances, fingers hovering over controls. This wasn't how morning television was supposed to unfold. This was the kind of confrontation reserved for late-night panels or cable news shout-fests, not a show built on smiles and soft transitions. As Karoline continued, she spoke directly to viewers at home, emphasizing transparency and honesty over comfort. She acknowledged that her views were controversial, but argued that controversy shouldn't be an excuse to shut someone down. George attempted to close the segment, his voice rising slightly as he signaled a wrap. Karoline finished her sentence anyway, her final words landing just as the cue to break flashed on the studio clock. The screen faded to commercial sooner than scheduled, music swelling awkwardly over the unresolved tension. In living rooms across the country, viewers stared at their televisions, unsure of what they had just witnessed but certain it wasn't business as usual. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was electric, phones buzzing, producers talking over one another, security standing just a bit closer than before. Whatever happened next, it was already clear that this moment would not simply disappear when the cameras turned away. When the show returned from commercial, the mood had shifted irreversibly. The camera opened on a different angle, the hosts seated closer together, the energy carefully reset. Karoline Leavitt's chair was empty. George Stephanopoulos delivered the next line with practiced calm, his voice smooth but slightly lower than before, as if grounding himself. He offered a brief transition, something vague about continuing conversations and respectful dialogue, then moved swiftly into the next segment. To the casual viewer, it might have seemed like a routine adjustment. To anyone who had been watching closely, it felt like the aftermath of a small explosion. Behind the scenes, the studio was anything but calm. Karoline stood near the edge of the set, her microphone already removed, a producer speaking to her in hushed, urgent tones. Another staffer hovered nearby, eyes darting between Karoline and the control room. The conversation was tense but controlled. Karoline's expression was firm, unflinching. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't pacing, she was standing still, listening, then responding quietly but decisively. Witnesses later said she made it clear she hadn't come to provoke chaos, only to speak without being silenced. When it became apparent the segment was over for good, she gathered her things and walked toward the exit without looking back. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Someone had already uploaded a shaky recording from their television, capturing the exact moment Karoline paused and called out the interruptions. The video spread fast, propelled by outrage, applause, disbelief, and curiosity in equal measure. Hashtags formed organically, arguments ignited in comment sections, and armchair analysts dissected every glance, every interruption, every inflection in both voices. Some viewers accused Karoline of grandstanding on live television. Others praised her composure under pressure, calling it a rare moment of resistance against what they viewed as a hostile interview style. Inside the GMA offices, phones rang non-stop. Executives fielded calls from network leadership, publicists, and advertisers wanting to know what had happened, and whether it would escalate. The control room replayed the footage repeatedly, searching for the moment when control slipped away. Opinions were divided. Some felt George had pushed too hard, too fast. Others argued Karoline had crossed an unspoken line by refusing to yield the floor. Everyone agreed on one thing: the moment couldn't be undone. George remained in the studio long after the cameras stopped rolling, sitting quietly as makeup artists and assistants packed up around him. Colleagues approached with careful words, supportive but noncommittal. He nodded, thanked them, said little. To the outside world, he projected composure, but those close to him sensed frustration beneath the surface. He believed in rigorous questioning. He believed that was his role. But he also understood television optics, and this one had not gone his way. Karoline, meanwhile, stepped into the bright daylight outside the studio, the city noise rushing in as if to punctuate the moment. She paused briefly as reporters called out questions, then continued walking, her phone already vibrating with messages. Advisors urged restraint, supporters urged boldness, critics were already framing their narratives. She released a short statement later that afternoon, measured in tone, saying she welcomed tough questions but stood by her right to finish her answers. It was neither an apology nor an escalation, and that ambiguity only fueled the fire. Throughout the day, commentators weighed in. Some framed the incident as evidence of deepening divides in media culture, where interviews had become battlegrounds rather than conversations. Others focused on the power dynamics of live television, arguing over who truly controlled the room. Former journalists, political strategists, and media critics all found angles to explore, each interpretation shaped by their own assumptions. The clash became a Rorschach test, revealing more about the audience than the moment itself. By evening, late-night shows referenced the incident with raised eyebrows and knowing smirks. Pundits replayed the pause, the silence before Karoline spoke up, as if it were a turning point frozen in time. That silence became symbolic. To some, it was defiance, to others, disruption. To everyone, it was unforgettable. George's closing expression, calm but taut, was analyzed frame by frame. Karoline's steady gaze was turned into memes, GIFs, and headlines. Inside the network, discussions turned to damage control. No official statement condemned or endorsed either party. Instead, carefully worded language emphasized lively discussion and the importance of diverse viewpoints. It satisfied no one completely, which in itself became another point of contention. Silence, some argued, was a stance. Others said it was the only responsible option. As the news cycle churned on, the moment began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just about what was said on set, it was about who was allowed to speak, how power was exercised, and what happened when the usual script broke down. For George, it was a reminder that even veteran hosts could lose control of the narrative. For Karoline, it became a defining episode, one that would follow her into future appearances, shaping expectations before she ever spoke. Days later, the studio returned to its normal rhythm. New guests sat in the same chair. New topics filled the air. The lights burned just as brightly. But for viewers who remembered that morning, something had shifted. The illusion of smooth, frictionless television had cracked, revealing the tension beneath. And though the cameras had cut away, the question lingered, long after the hashtags faded and the clips slowed, about whether being kicked off was truly a loss, or simply the moment someone refused to play their assigned role.